You said you'd be home at 6.
I got held up at work, Claire.
You're always held up at work.
And you're always looking for something to complain about.
Because you never listen!
Because every conversation with you—
For 6 years, Claire and Daniel fought about everything. Money, time, the small resentments that build a wall between two people one brick at a time. Neighbors on their quiet street in Ohio grew used to the sound of raised voices drifting from an open kitchen window. Friends stopped asking how things were going, because they already knew the answer. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the arguing simply stopped. Daniel woke up expecting the usual tension at the breakfast table. Instead, he found Claire humming to herself, setting 2 plates down with a smile he hadn't seen in years. He thought, finally, that they had turned a corner. He believed the hardest part of their marriage was behind them. He had no idea it was only beginning. For weeks, Daniel told himself he'd won something. The house felt lighter. Claire laughed at his jokes again, packed his lunch, kissed him goodbye at the door like she used to when they were newly married. He bragged to his brother that they'd finally figured it out, that maybe all a marriage needed was time. But somewhere behind that calm, small things had already started shifting in ways Daniel could not yet see. A drawer in the hallway desk that had always stayed unlocked now had a key Claire kept on her. Her phone, once left face up on the counter, was suddenly always in her pocket. None of it seemed to matter on its own. Together, it would mean everything. Months later, in a quiet hospital corridor under fluorescent light, Daniel would sit alone with his hands shaking, replaying every peaceful dinner, every kiss goodbye, searching for the moment he missed the signs. A single phone call, made from a stairwell where she thought no one could hear, would end up changing the direction of both their lives. But that was still ahead of him. On that Tuesday morning, all Daniel knew was that his wife was finally happy again, and for a man who had spent 6 years bracing for the next argument, that was enough. He did not ask why. He did not think to. And that single choice would haunt him for the rest of his life. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Claire had grown up watching her own parents' marriage crumble under the weight of unspoken resentment, and she had promised herself she would never let silence be the thing that broke her. Yet here she was, choosing silence anyway, though not for the reasons anyone around her would have guessed. Daniel, for his part, had always been a man who solved problems the way he'd been taught, by working harder, staying later, believing that effort alone could fix what words could not. Their marriage had been built on that mismatch for years, her needing to be heard, him needing to fix things instead of feeling them. It had worn them both down long before that Tuesday morning ever came. What changed was not the marriage itself, but Claire's decision about what to do with it, a decision she had been turning over for longer than Daniel would ever have guessed, long before the fighting ever stopped. By the time Daniel noticed the locked drawer, 3 months had already passed since the silence began. He told himself it was nothing, that every marriage had its private corners, that a grown woman was entitled to a drawer of her own. He did not know that inside it sat a folder of documents Claire had been quietly assembling, page by page, during the hours he assumed she was out walking or running errands. He did not know about the calls made from parking lots, the notebook hidden inside a shoebox at the back of her closet, or the name written across its first page that was not his own. All he knew was that his wife was calmer than she had been in years, and that the man who had spent 6 years longing for peace was no longer willing to question where it had come from. Claire had been raised in a small house outside Dayton, the middle child of a mother who cried quietly in the kitchen and a father who never once raised his voice, not because he was calm, but because he had learned long ago that silence could hurt more than shouting ever could. She promised herself as a teenager that she would never marry a man who left her guessing. Daniel, on the other hand, grew up an only child in a home where love was shown through provision rather than conversation. His father worked 2 jobs and rarely sat still long enough to ask how anyone felt. When Claire and Daniel met at 24, at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in the summer heat, They mistook their differences for balance, believing her warmth and his steadiness would complete something neither of them had growing up. Their first few years together were, by most accounts, good ones. Daniel proposed on a hiking trail in the Hocking Hills, nervous and fumbling with the ring box, and Claire said yes before he even finished the sentence. They bought a modest 3-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac, the kind with a swing set already in the backyard from the previous owners, and for a while it felt like the life they had both been promised. Daniel took a job at a logistics company that paid well but demanded long hours, and Claire worked part-time at a pediatric dental office while going back to school for her accounting degree. Friends who knew them then describe a couple that seemed, on the surface, like any other young marriage finding its footing, laughing easily at parties, holding hands at church functions, the kind of pair other couples half-jokingly said they envied. Claire's mother had warned her, gently, before the wedding, that marriage had a way of revealing exactly the parts of a person you least expected to see. At the time, Claire had laughed the comment off, certain that whatever came, she and Daniel would face it together, the way they had faced everything up to that point. She did not yet understand that a person could love someone deeply and still feel entirely alone inside the relationship, that two people could share a bed every night and grow further apart with each passing year, without either of them noticing until the distance had already become permanent. Looking back, those first years would later feel to Claire like a memory that belonged to someone else entirely, a version of herself she could recognize but no longer fully understand. The cracks started small, the way they usually do. Daniel began staying later at work, telling himself it was for the family, for the future, for the house they were still paying off. Claire began feeling like a roommate rather than a wife, managing the household, the bills, the small emergencies of daily life largely on her own. She would bring up how alone she felt, and Daniel, uncomfortable with emotional conversations, would respond with solutions instead of understanding, suggesting she hire a housekeeper or take a class to meet new people, missing entirely what she was actually asking for. Within 3 years, what had once been occasional disagreements hardened into a pattern neither of them knew how to break. There was a particular evening, in the 3rd year of their marriage, that Claire would later describe as the moment something inside her quietly closed. She had planned a small anniversary dinner, candles and a dish she had spent all afternoon preparing, only for Daniel to call at 6:30 to say he was still at the office and would be another 2 hours at least. She ate alone that night, the candles burning down to nothing on the table, and when Daniel finally came home, apologetic and exhausted, she told him it was fine, that she understood, that work came first sometimes. She did not tell him that something in her had decided, quietly and without ceremony, that she would stop expecting him to notice the things that mattered to her, and that she would learn, instead, to carry that disappointment alone. By year 4, the arguments had a rhythm to them. They would start over something minor, a bill left unpaid, a dish left in the sink, and escalate into something neither person meant to say. Daniel would eventually go quiet and retreat to the garage, tinkering with nothing in particular just to have somewhere to stand that wasn't in the same room as his wife. Claire would sit at the kitchen table long after he left, replaying the conversation, wondering when exactly they had become people who spoke to each other this way. Neighbors later recalled hearing raised voices through open windows on summer nights, though none of them ever imagined it as anything more than an unhappy but ordinary marriage working through its problems. Daniel's co-workers, when later interviewed, described a man who rarely spoke about his home life at all, who threw himself into projects at the office with an intensity some read as ambition and others privately suspected was avoidance. He picked up extra shifts that weren't required of him, volunteered for assignments that kept him traveling 2 or 3 nights a month, and told himself each time that the extra income was for Claire, for their future, for a life he imagined they would eventually settle into together. He did not see, or did not let himself see, That every hour spent away from home was also an hour he did not have to sit across from a wife whose unhappiness he did not know how to fix. It was during year 5 that Claire met a man named Marcus through a continuing education course she had enrolled in to finish her accounting degree. He was easy to talk to in a way Daniel no longer was, patient in conversations the way her husband used to be before work consumed him. What began as study sessions at a coffee shop near campus slowly became something Claire kept from Daniel entirely. Not because she had decided anything yet, but because for the first time in years, someone was asking her how she felt and actually waiting for the answer. She told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that she was simply lonely, that plenty of unhappy spouses had a friend they leaned on without it becoming anything more. Marcus was, by his own account later given to investigators, drawn to Claire almost immediately, though he insisted for months that his intentions remained entirely appropriate. He had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier, one that had left him bitter toward the idea of marriage as an institution, and he found in Claire someone who understood exhaustion, who understood the particular loneliness of being unhappy inside a relationship everyone assumed was fine from the outside. Their conversations, at first about coursework and classroom assignments, gradually shifted toward the personal, late-night text exchanges that neither of them mentioned to anyone else, each one telling themselves it was harmless, that talking was different from doing anything wrong. By the start of year 6, Claire had stopped trying to explain herself to Daniel altogether. The arguments continued, but something in her had quietly shifted underneath them, a decision forming in pieces she had not yet said out loud, even to herself. She began paying closer attention to the household finances, to which accounts were in both their names and which were not, to what she would need if she ever chose a different life. Daniel noticed none of this. He was too consumed by his own frustration, too certain that the tension between them was simply the price of a demanding job and a long marriage, to see that his wife was no longer fighting for the relationship. She was preparing to leave it, in a way far more complicated than simply walking out the door. It was Marcus who first raised the idea, casually at first, over coffee on a Sunday afternoon while Daniel was away at a work conference in Columbus. He had asked Claire, half joking, what was actually stopping her from leaving, and when she listed the practical fears, splitting assets, a messy legal fight, the judgment of people who had known them both for years, he suggested there might be a cleaner way to walk away with everything and nothing to fight over. At the time, Claire brushed the comment off as dark humor, the kind of thing people say without meaning anything by it. She would later testify that she did not take the idea seriously for months, though the conversation stayed with her in a way she could not fully explain even to herself. The incident that would later change everything did not begin as a crisis. It began on an ordinary Thursday evening in October, 6 months after the arguing had stopped and 4 months after Claire had first opened the locked drawer in front of anyone but herself, though Daniel did not yet know that drawer existed. Daniel had come home earlier than usual, feeling unusually tired, a heaviness in his chest he chalked up to a long week and too much coffee. Claire made dinner, the same warm routine she had kept up for months, and Daniel ate without noticing anything different about the way she watched him from across the table, quieter than usual, her hands folded in her lap long after her own plate was empty. Daniel would later tell investigators that nothing about that particular evening stood out to him at the time, that he had simply assumed the exhaustion pulling at his body was the accumulation of months of long hours and disrupted sleep. He remembered mentioning, almost in passing, that his coffee tasted slightly different that week, bitter in a way he couldn't place, and Claire had laughed it off, blaming the new brand she'd picked up at the grocery store. He had believed her without a second thought, the same way he had believed almost everything she told him over the past 6 months, because believing her required so much less energy than questioning why. After 6 years of tension, his wife had suddenly become the person he had always hoped she would be. By 9 that night, Daniel's fatigue had turned into something sharper, a tightness behind his ribs and a dizziness that made the hallway tilt when he stood. Claire suggested he lie down, told him it was probably just stress, and stayed close by his side in a way that friends would later describe as devoted when they recounted the story to investigators. Around midnight, Daniel woke gasping, unable to catch his breath, and it was Claire who called for help, her voice steady on the phone in a way that struck the dispatcher as almost too composed for the situation being described. Paramedics arrived within minutes and rushed him to the hospital, where doctors began running tests that would not return clear answers for several days. It was in that hospital corridor, under the same fluorescent light Daniel had once imagined in passing and never expected to actually stand beneath, that the first real questions began to form, not in his mind, but in the minds of the people treating him. A cardiologist reviewing his blood work noted inconsistencies that did not match a simple case of stress or exhaustion. A nurse recalled Claire asking unusually specific questions about dosage and recovery time, questions that seemed reasonable coming from a frightened spouse, but were logged out of routine caution anyway. None of it amounted to an accusation, not yet, but it was enough for one attending physician to quietly flag the case for further review, a decision that would not reach Daniel himself for almost 2 more weeks. Claire sat by his bedside for most of those days, holding his hand, speaking softly to nurses about his medical history, appearing to anyone who walked past exactly like a wife terrified of losing her husband. Family members who visited during that week later described her as almost eerily calm, a composure they attributed at the time to some inner strength, a way of holding herself together for Daniel's sake. Only in hindsight, after everything came out, would several of them admit privately that something about her stillness had felt slightly off, though none of them could have said, in the moment, exactly what it was that troubled them. Daniel was discharged 5 days later with a diagnosis that satisfied no one completely, an irregular reaction attributed to a medication interaction that his own doctor did not recall prescribing at that dose. He went home believing he had simply had a frightening health scare, grateful for a wife who had stayed by his hospital bed nearly around the clock, who had cried in front of the nurses, who had held his hand through every test. He had no reason yet to connect the notebook in the shoebox, the locked drawer, the late-night calls from parking lots, or the man named Marcus to the 10 days he had just spent recovering. That connection would not begin to form in his mind until a phone rang 3 weeks later from a woman he had never met, asking to speak with him privately about his wife. The weeks following Daniel's discharge were, on the surface, some of the gentlest the marriage had seen in years. Claire cooked his favorite meals, checked on him constantly, insisted he rest instead of returning to work too quickly. Daniel found himself, despite everything, grateful for the health scare in a strange way, telling his brother over the phone that sometimes it took something frightening to remind 2 people what they meant to each other. He did not yet know that his recovery was being watched not only by Claire, but from a distance, by a detective 2 counties away who had received a flagged file from the hospital and was quietly beginning to ask questions of his own. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Daniel was back at work, sitting at his desk trying to convince himself that life had returned to normal. The woman on the line identified herself only as someone who used to work alongside Marcus at a firm 2 counties over, and she said she felt she owed it to Daniel to tell him what she knew, even if it meant nothing. She described conversations she had overheard in a break room months earlier, conversations about a marriage that was, in her words, already over in every way that mattered except paperwork. Daniel sat frozen at his desk, the phone pressed hard against his ear, asking questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered, while the woman on the other end grew increasingly uncomfortable with how much she had already said. He did not sleep at all that night. He lay in bed beside Claire, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, running through every strange moment of the past 6 months, the locked drawer, the phone always in her pocket, The questions to the nurse that a friend at the hospital had mentioned in passing without thinking anything of it at the time. Pieces that had meant nothing individually began, for the first time, to feel like they belonged to the same picture, though Daniel still could not make out what that picture actually was. He told himself he was overreacting, that grief and fear could make a person imagine connections that weren't really there, and yet some instinct kept pulling him back toward the one place in the house he had never thought to look. That night, Daniel did something he had never done in 6 years of marriage. He waited until Claire had fallen asleep, and he went looking for answers in the one place he had never thought to look, the locked drawer in the hallway desk that he had walked past 100 times without a second thought. He found the key inside an old jewelry box Claire rarely touched, and his hands were unsteady as he turned it in the lock. Inside, he found the folder first, papers detailing accounts he did not recognize, and a beneficiary form with his own signature forged beneath it. Beneath the folder sat the notebook from the shoebox, and on its first page, written in Claire's familiar handwriting, was a name that was not his own, followed by dates that lined up with almost every moment he had felt inexplicably unwell over the past several months. He read through the notebook slowly, sitting on the floor of the hallway in the dark, careful not to make a sound that might wake her. Entry after entry described feelings Claire had never once spoken aloud to him: exhaustion, resentment, a longing for a life she felt she had lost somewhere along the way. Further in, the entries changed tone, becoming shorter, more clinical, notes about timing and dosage that Daniel did not fully understand in the moment, but that made the back of his neck go cold regardless. He photographed each page carefully with his phone, his hands shaking so badly that several of the pictures came out blurred, and he returned everything to exactly where he had found it before slipping back into bed beside a wife he no longer recognized. Daniel did not confront Claire that night. Instead, he photographed every page with shaking hands, returned everything exactly as he had found it, and drove to a 24-hour diner where he sat alone until sunrise, trying to make sense of what he had just uncovered. By morning, he had made 2 decisions. The first was to say nothing to Claire until he understood more. The second was to call the same hospital that had treated him weeks earlier and ask, calmly as he could manage, whether anyone there still had questions about his case. The nurse who answered remembered him immediately, and within an hour, Daniel found himself on the phone with a detective from the county sheriff's office who had, unbeknownst to him, already opened a quiet file of his own. Detective Ray Alvarez had been assigned the case almost accidentally, after the flagged blood work from Daniel's hospital stay crossed his desk during a routine review of unusual medical incidents reported by local providers. He had not yet contacted Daniel directly, preferring to gather background first, and Daniel's call landed on his desk the same morning he had planned to reach out himself. Alvarez had spent nearly 15 years working cases that rarely made headlines, quiet domestic matters that unfolded slowly behind closed doors rather than in dramatic, visible violence. And something about the pattern in Daniel's file had struck him as familiar in a way he couldn't yet articulate. Over the following 2 weeks, Alvarez worked to corroborate what Daniel had found, pulling financial records, phone data, and pharmacy logs that painted a picture far more deliberate than either man had initially wanted to believe. He interviewed the nurse who had first flagged Claire's questions during Daniel's hospital stay, then reached out quietly to the continuing education program Claire had attended years earlier, uncovering Marcus's name for the first time through class rosters rather than through anything Daniel had told him. What emerged was not a single reckless decision, but a pattern stretched across months, careful and quiet, hidden inside the very calm that had once made Daniel believe his marriage was finally healing. For a while, investigators considered another possibility entirely, that Marcus alone was responsible, and that Claire was simply a woman caught in an affair she hadn't fully understood the danger of. Phone records seemed to support this theory at first, showing Marcus initiating most of the late-night calls and researching medication interactions from his own home computer. Alvarez, ever methodical, refused to close the door on either possibility too early, aware from years of experience that the first clear theory in a case was rarely the whole truth. He continued pulling records, cross-referencing timestamps, building a timeline detailed enough to withstand whatever explanation either Claire or Marcus eventually offered. But a search of Claire's laptop, conducted 3 weeks into the investigation, revealed browser history that could not be explained away so easily. Searches made from her own account, during hours Daniel had assumed she was at work, that matched almost exactly the medical questions the hospital nurse had once found strange coming from a frightened spouse. Alvarez sat with that discovery for a long while before deciding on his next move, aware that the moment he brought Claire in for questioning, there would be no quiet way to undo what had already been set in motion for her, for Daniel, and for the marriage that had already been unraveling long before anyone outside their home had noticed. By the time Detective Alvarez brought Claire in for formal questioning, 6 weeks had passed since Daniel's hospital stay, and he had spent every one of those weeks going through the motions of a marriage he no longer recognized, sleeping in the guest room under the excuse of a bad back, watching his wife move through their home with the same practiced calm that had once comforted him and now made his skin crawl. Claire, for her part, had no idea Daniel knew anything at all. She continued setting 2 plates at dinner, continued asking about his day, continued being, in every visible way, the wife he had spent 6 years wishing for. It was this performance, more than anything else, that investigators would later point to as evidence of just how carefully she had planned every part of what came after. Those 6 weeks were, for Daniel, the loneliest of his life, lonelier even than the years of arguing had ever been. He went to work each day and came home each night to a house that looked exactly as it always had, sat across from a woman he had shared a bed with for 6 years, and said nothing about the photographs saved quietly on his phone. He later described that period to a close friend as feeling like living inside a stranger's life, watching himself go through familiar motions while some other version of him, somewhere just beneath the surface, was screaming for the whole thing to stop. He did not tell his parents. He did not tell his brother. He told no one at all until the day Alvarez called to let him know that Claire had been brought in. When Claire arrived at the sheriff's office, she believed she was there to answer routine questions about Daniel's medical history, a story Alvarez had carefully constructed to avoid tipping his hand too early. It took less than 20 minutes of gentle, methodical questioning before her composure began to crack, small inconsistencies surfacing between what she said and what the financial records already showed. Alvarez did not raise his voice or accuse her outright. He simply laid out the beneficiary form with Daniel's forged signature, the pharmacy logs, and the search history from her laptop, one piece at a time, and watched as the woman across the table went from confident to silent to, finally, quietly asking for a lawyer. News of Claire's arrest spread quickly through the small circle of friends and family who had known the couple for years, most of them reacting with a disbelief that bordered on refusal, certain there had to be some explanation that would make all of it make sense. Daniel's mother, in particular, struggled for weeks to accept what had happened, telling neighbors that Claire had always seemed like such a gentle person, the kind of daughter-in-law she had once bragged about to her own friends. It was only as the details of the investigation slowly became public, through court filings and eventually through local news coverage, that even Claire's closest confidants began to understand just how long she had been living a version of her marriage that none of them had ever seen. What came out over the following months, through discovery and eventually through Claire's own testimony as part of a plea agreement, was a picture far more complicated than a simple affair gone wrong. Claire had not set out, at the beginning, to hurt Daniel at all. Her original plan, formed sometime around year 5 of their marriage, had simply been to leave, to quietly build a financial cushion and an exit strategy that would let her walk away without the drawn-out conflict she had watched destroy her own parents' marriage. It was Marcus, already carrying resentments of his own toward a business partner unrelated to Daniel entirely, who had first raised the idea that a slower, less traceable ending might serve them both better than a messy divorce, one that would let Claire walk away with everything and Daniel none the wiser. Claire maintained, both to investigators and later in court, that she had never intended for things to go as far as they did, that what began as research born out of curiosity and anger slowly became something she could not find her way back out of once Marcus started supplying the medication himself. She described, in her own testimony, the specific night she crossed from research into action, sitting alone in her car outside a pharmacy 2 towns over, telling herself she was only gathering information, not yet admitting to herself what that information was actually for. Whether that was true, or simply the version of events that gave her the best chance at a reduced sentence, became the central question of the trial that followed. Daniel sat through nearly every day of it, in the back row of a courtroom he never imagined he would find himself in, listening to his wife describe, in clinical detail, the small doses she had administered over nearly 2 months, timed carefully enough to look like exhaustion, like stress, like anything other than what it actually was. He listened to expert witnesses explain how the substances involved could accumulate slowly in the body, producing symptoms that mimicked ordinary fatigue long before they became dangerous enough to require hospitalization, a detail that made Daniel physically ill the first time he heard it explained aloud in the courtroom. The trial lasted 11 days, and for most of them, Daniel sat in the same seat in the back row, close enough to hear everything and far enough that Claire rarely had to look directly at him. The prosecution built its case around the timeline Alvarez had assembled, the searches, the pharmacy logs tied to a clinic 2 towns over where Marcus had once worked, and the notebook that had started it all, which turned out to contain far more than a single name. Page after page detailed not just dosages and dates, but Claire's own uncertainty, written in fragments late at night, questioning whether she was capable of going through with what she and Marcus had discussed, then, weeks later, writing that it was already too late to stop. The defense argued that Claire had been manipulated, that Marcus, older and more experienced in exactly this kind of quiet cruelty, had guided a frightened, unhappy woman towards something she would never have considered alone. Claire's attorney called 2 witnesses who described Marcus as controlling in his previous relationships, attempting to paint a picture of a woman gradually pulled under the influence of a man skilled at making his own choices feel like someone else's idea. Prosecutors countered with the browser history from her own laptop, evidence that Claire had continued researching long after Marcus had supplied what he claimed she needed, suggesting an involvement far more active than the defense wanted the jury to believe. On the 9th day, Marcus took a plea deal of his own, testifying against Claire in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony described a partnership rather than a manipulation, 2 people who had each convinced the other that what they were doing was justified. He described their late-night phone calls not as one person guiding another, but as 2 people talking each other deeper into a plan neither one, alone, might ever have carried out, each using the other's certainty to quiet their own doubts. His testimony visibly unsettled Claire, who sat rigid at the defense table, her composure finally breaking as the man she had once trusted most described, in careful legal language, exactly how far the 2 of them had gone together. The jury deliberated for just under 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of attempted poisoning and conspiracy, though notably not attempted murder, a distinction the prosecution had argued for based on the doses involved, which experts testified were calibrated to cause illness rather than death, at least at first. Claire was sentenced to 11 years, with the possibility of parole after 7. Marcus received 9. Daniel did not speak at sentencing. Though he had prepared a statement, he ultimately chose not to read, later telling a reporter outside the courthouse only that he hoped Claire would use the time to understand what she had actually done, not just to him, but to herself. In the years since, Daniel sold the house on the cul-de-sac and moved 2 states away, rebuilding a life he says still does not feel entirely like his own. He has spoken publicly only a handful of times, always declining to frame himself as anything other than a man who missed the signs he now believes, looking back, had been there all along, hidden inside a calm he mistook for peace. He remarried briefly, 3 years after the trial, though that relationship ended quietly within 18 months, something Daniel has attributed, in the rare interviews he has given, to a difficulty trusting stillness in a marriage ever again, a suspicion that quiet happiness might always be hiding something underneath it. Claire, for her part, has maintained through several parole hearings that she takes full responsibility, though she has never fully explained the 6 months between deciding to leave and deciding, instead, to make Daniel sick. Those who have attended her hearings describe a woman who appears, even now, difficult to read completely, sincere in her stated remorse, and yet still guarded in a way that leaves observers uncertain how much of the full story has ever actually been told. Prison counselors who have worked with her over the years describe her as a model of quiet compliance, the same composure that once made her so difficult to suspect now serving, perhaps, as the only version of herself she still knows how to be. What remains unresolved, even now, is the question the case never quite answered: whether Claire began as a woman planning an exit and became something else along the way, or whether the plan was always more dangerous than anyone, including Daniel, ever wanted to believe. Detective Alvarez, asked about the case years later, said only that in his experience, the most dangerous plans are rarely the ones announced with shouting or threats. They are the quiet ones, built slowly inside a calm that everyone around them mistakes for peace, hidden in plain sight by the very silence that should have been the loudest warning sign of all. If this story affected you the way it affected us, let us know in the comments what stood out to you most, and whether you noticed any warning signs in Claire and Daniel's story before the reveal. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of our upcoming true stories, and we'll see you in the next video.